Alrighty. Hi everyone, my name is Blake. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Aeronics Inc. We're a Pittsburgh-based company, and today I'll be showing you a little bit our work on portable oxygen systems for defense applications, specifically in the US. So to get started, I just wanted to give a little bit of a background on our company. So xTechSearch is our first kind of foray into the defense space. We have commercial products available now, and we've kind of developed the foundational technology that we're looking forward to applying in the defense space. So we specialize in oxygen delivery systems. First started on the human side and have since kind of gone on from there. Our current applications that I'm going to be talking about today support canine halo insertion, medevac, and prolonged field care within the United States Army. So I'd like to start out by just giving a brief background of how oxygen is used in the US Army. And it's actually pretty interesting because the use of oxygen in the Army and in all of the defense spaces right now is in a bit of a state of flux. Oxygen has a lot of old technology behind it, these high pressure tanks, these oxygen concentrators that are slowly getting better. So right now the doctrine on how oxygen is used is set to change, and we're kind of right in the middle of that and looking to capitalize on that to implement our systems in there. So we really focus on three main medical treatment facilities or situations in which oxygen would be used. We have a level 1 medical treatment facility, which is just the battlefield, right? And right now, for level 1 medical treatment facilities, they have no access to oxygen. So a combat medic specialist does not carry oxygen, and oxygen is not a part of the soldier kit, even though it is one of the most important treatments for acute respiratory distress or for any kind of lung trauma. And you get lung trauma anytime you have an IED blast or any kind of bomb go off. So it's one of the most common injuries on the battlefield, and right now they don't have the treatment they need during that golden hour after the blast is sustained. In level 2 and level 3 medical treatment facilities, they kind of graduate into larger oxygen generator systems. So those are systems that range in size from about the size of a pallet to the size of a building. And they call them portable in that they can be moved, but they certainly are too large to be moved in a quick amount of time or carried on the soldier kit. So because of that, we have this discrepancy. We have oxygen that is not available where we need it, and then very large immovable oxygen systems that we have to bring our soldiers to. So we are really focusing on, for the purpose of this pitch, the level 1 medical treatment facility. We want to equip our combat medics with oxygen on the battlefield so they can treat some of these injuries as a result of IED blasts. So the reason we have this gap in oxygen is that gases are just fundamentally difficult to store. It's been a problem in all industries. That's why you have people with respiratory disease carrying around large tanks. It's why you have high compression systems. It's why we don't have methane cars running around right now. There's all kinds of issues because those gas molecules, they just like to spread out, right? They really just take up the volume of whatever container they're in. So historically, we've needed incredibly high pressure tanks with these thick walls, and heavy tanks in general, to squeeze those molecules into a small enough amount of space. But a universal property of all gases is that they concentrate on surfaces. And so we can take advantage of this property to increase the storage capacity of our tanks by increasing the internal the internal surface area. So I'll go through a bit of a demonstration. One way we could imagine doing this would be by adding walls or fins on the inside of our tanks. Each fin provides a new surface upon which gas concentrates. And it works. We get a modest increase in capacity. We take this to the extreme. We use these molecular sponges called adsorbents that soak up oxygen like a sponge soaks up water and dramatically increase that internal surface area, thereby increasing the amount of oxygen we can fit in that tank. So we are not the first people to design these materials for gas storage. We're just the first to make it work for oxygen. Oxygen is especially difficult because it's a small molecule and it's not very polar. So it doesn't like to stick to things and it doesn't like to store in these materials well. And essentially what we have here is a porous adsorbent. We have lots of different kinds that is finely tuned to store oxygen. This is basically a nanoscale view. If I held a few in my hand, which I should have brought, They're about the size of a grain of sand, and about a gram of these materials could have the surface area of an entire football field. So what we do is we essentially fill our tank with these materials, and we can fit up to 2 to 3 times more oxygen in that tank by filling it with materials, which is a little counterintuitive. So our first CONOP for the US Army that is using this technology is a multi-purpose portable oxygen device that has 20 liters of oxygen. The reason we chose that amount of oxygen is because it's portable enough to be carried on the soldier kit. So I'm going to be passing these around to the judges. I'll start one over here. There you go. So this product has 20 liters of oxygen in it. It's at 200 psi, which is about 1/10 of the pressure of a standard oxygen tank, which means it can be sold or carried on the soldier kit without danger of explosion from being under fire or anything like that. It's less than a pound, and it has a displacement of 0.65 liters. We see applications for this in veterinary, which I'll get to in a little bit, in halo insertion for both canines and humans, and in level 1 medical treatment facilities. Like I said, equipping combat medics with oxygen. The benefits of this are that they are cost effective. Because we're bringing down the pressure of this device by over 90%, we're able to use cost effective materials that are an order of magnitude cheaper. So these products, they're low pressure and they don't require an extensive infrastructure for refilling or anything like that. So normally when you would bring oxygen cylinders onto the battlefield, you need an infrastructure for charging those back up again, right? These can be shipped standard shipping, they can be airdropped in, so there's no infrastructure required for equipping people with oxygen in remote locations. And we've equipped it with a fixed flow regulator. All you do is insert the regulator into the top of the canister and twist to begin flow. This is something that has to be able to be done in a split second because these are soldiers that if they were carrying it on the kit and they're injured, they need to be able to treat themselves with oxygen almost immediately using a mask like the one here. So I'll go into a bit of the specific use cases. I mentioned veterinary first, which does seem like a far cry from the US Army. The reason I mention that is because that's actually our first commercial application. We already sell a product that has been doing well in the commercial veterinary market. Veterinarians use this to transport oxygen-dependent animals from one clinic to the other. They also use it for triage in clinic. It's saved multiple animals' lives, and the reason we started with this application is because it's allowed us to scale the technology. This is something that really doesn't make sense until you're making 10,000 of them, right, on the economics. So this has allowed us to prove out our distribution, to prove out our manufacturing, and now we're successfully selling a product in the veterinary market. It does relate to the Army because the Army has over 3,000 working dogs. Each of these working dogs represents a $500,000 to $1 million investment per dog to get them trained. And some of these dogs die from exhaustion, which is lack of oxygen. There's also 30,000 animals treated annually across over 100 veterinary locations at the Army's facilities, and this is an easy application there to save lives in transfer and in the clinic. So again, this is a great test case to prove out the technology, that it works, and that it's scalable. After that, we see this moving into halo insertion. The reason we came after this application is because we were approached by a contractor, Complete Parachute Solutions, who explained to us a core problem they were having. So during high altitude, low opening jumps, Special Forces sometimes jump with dogs like Cairo. So Cairo is part of SEAL Team 6. He's a Belgian Malinois, which is the typical working dog breed. These are highly trained animals. These types of working dogs have over $1 million in investment per animal. And what they're doing right now is jumping from 38,000 feet and just holding their breath. So not enough air up there to breathe. Humans are carrying an oxygen tank, but they're too big to put on. So right now, basically what we have is these dogs holding their breath as their handler is carrying them down from 38,000 feet, right? So we're trying to fix that. They came to us looking for a portable oxygen solution, and we see this as a great fit. It's something that once you hit the ground, you can dispose of and not worry about it anymore. It's no additional weight once you're on the ground. And these use cases are really to prove out what we want to do, which is a broad deployment among combat medics. So we want this product to be equipped with these combat medics so they can treat these IED blasts, these acute respiratory distress disorders during the golden hour, because that is one of the most important parts for both acute care and long-term care. So in the absence of oxygen, what's happening is mechanical ventilation. And mechanical ventilation is not so good for long-term health. Essentially, 40% of soldiers who are mechanically ventilated develop acute respiratory distress disorder, which is a syndrome that can result in you being medically discharged from the Army. So long-term, you're losing soldiers because they're not being treated in the short term correctly. So before I move on to our next use case, are there any questions about the use cases I've just mentioned?
So the length of time for the canister use, it's about 10 minutes, is that correct?
Yeah, and I had a bit of a typo on that label, so it should be between 20 and 30 minutes actually.
Okay.
And the great part about that is if that's not long enough, you just grab 2, and it doesn't take up that much more room, and you have an hour.
Okay.
Great. So I will move on to some of our other applications. So what we really are working towards is an improved D cylinder. Now, this doesn't look super impressive because it is just a D cylinder. It's the most common form factor of oxygen used in the entire world. It's about this size, and it stores about 420 liters of oxygen. The problem with these cylinders is that they've been the same for about 100 years, and they've always just stored 420 liters of oxygen. They're at an incredibly high pressure, 220 psi, which is one of the reasons that they aren't carried out onto the battlefield right now, in addition to the weight factor, right? So by equipping our materials within this canister, we can increase the capacity by, right now, 1.5 times. So that equates to around 640 liters of oxygen in that tank at the exact same pressure. But since our general, our foundational improvement is storing more oxygen at lower pressures, we can also do the reverse. We can just lower the pressure in cases where safety is a bigger factor, or you want to lightweight the tank, and we can go to a lower pressure and store the same amount of oxygen that they're storing right now. So right now, we see the application for this obviously across level 1 through level 3 medical treatment facilities, but also for medevac. D cylinders are equipped on a lot of different Army vehicles, including the helicopters, and usually it takes anywhere between a half hour and 2 hours to get that person who is likely on oxygen from the battlefield to a level 2 or level 3 treatment facility where they can be treated more effectively. So we really think that medevac is the first kind of insertion of this technology. Right now, we have proven capacity gains in this tank. What we need to do is shelf life testing. That's what we've already started. We need to make sure that with our materials in these cylinders, they can sit in a warehouse for a long period of time and be pulled out and work perfectly. So that's what we're working on right now, is some accelerated aging testing. Like I said, medevac is...
Quick question before you move on. So why, with the D cylinder, does it need to be at such a high pressure when your other canisters are at a low pressure? I thought the whole point was with the adsorbent that you didn't have to operate at high pressures. Yeah, so essentially our improvement we get from the adsorbent kind of goes like this at high pressures. So we get upwards of a 4 to 5x gain at extremely low pressures. So in this canister, this is similar to a canister you would actually see for hairspray or air freshener. That's why it's so inexpensive. This would typically store almost no oxygen. A few liters, a useless amount. Because we're operating at low pressure and we put our adsorbents in there, we can all of a sudden achieve a useful amount of oxygen in still an incredibly low pressure. We do get as we raise that pressure, the factor we get is lower, but the reason we think we still need to have it high pressure is because we don't think the Army is going to get rid of all of their D cylinders right now. This is really a foundational change where we would want to equip their cylinders, and so they would probably still be operating at similar pressures, right? Or at least they would have the same, let's say, wall thickness. So we're not really solving the lightweight problem right now if we're using their cylinders, I guess. So instead, why don't we just maximize the amount we can fit in there? So this is definitely a more horizon application because while we can do it,
it's going to take, there's so many cylinders out there right now in the Army, and this is going to take a lot more, it'd be a large deployment, essentially. So I said medevac is really our first insertion of this, just because it's a critical need we've seen. So that's what we'll be looking to do, is test this in those situations once we've completed our shelf life testing. And then I always like to talk about the horizon applications, because while we're working on implementing our materials, we're always looking on how to store more oxygen. That is the whole name of the game, right? More oxygen, like if you can store even a 10% gain, it equates to more soldiers saved. So what we've been working on recently is reducing the amount of wasted space in that canister. We're using something that is kind of similar to sand in how it looks. So when you fill a tank with that, you have a lot of empty space, right? You can't perfectly stack those or compact them. What we've been doing is compressing the adsorbent with PTFE, Teflon, and compressing it into a sheet. Basically what that does is we get to reduce our void fraction, or the wasted space in the tank, from 40% to 15%. And that results in a 2x capacity gain over a traditional tank. So our idea would be, by the time we're ready to deploy a D cylinder, if we implement more of a sheet-based adsorbent rather than our granular materials, we could get that up to 2x. So that's basically 850 liters in a D cylinder, which is huge savings in terms of oxygen efficiency there. So I just thought I'd mention that. So our strategic partners are really important here. We don't have the most experience in the defense space, because xTechSearch was our first experience with it. So Complete Parachute Solutions is a partner we hope to keep working with. They originally approached us with the idea for canine halo insertion, which is why that is our front runner for the first application. Calgon Carbon is an international materials company that's helped us with some of our adsorption testing and shelf life aging. And then BC3 Technologies helps us with contract manufacturing. All our products are manufactured in Baltimore, Maryland, actually. And as far as deployment, I talked about this a little bit, but year one, that's 2019 right now, we have already deployed our veterinary product. It's doing well in over 40 clinics across the US. We hope to get to over 100 clinics within the next couple months. So that's really helped prove out the scalability of this technology. In year two, we'd like to deploy the defense application based on that initial technology. That would be for human and veterinary applications, both on the battlefield and in halo insertions. And then year three would be the deployment of the adsorbent-enabled D-tank. Again, that's a much larger deployment that takes a lot more working with different areas of the Army to do, so that'll take a little bit more time. I think our team is really important here. If you notice probably the average age of the people on the left, it's very young. So the only reason we've gotten to this point is because we've had excellent advisory that has been involved on a day-by-day basis. So I founded the company with my two co-founders, Mark Spitz and Alec Kaya. Alex over there. I'll be calling him Dr. Kaya soon, because he is finishing up his PhD in chemical engineering and materials science at the University of Pittsburgh. He is the reason we originally came up with this idea. We were studying ways to store more oxygen in a smaller amount of space for people with respiratory disease, and that was the genesis of the technology. Dr. Chris Wilmer is a thought leader in materials research. He has another company that uses these advanced materials to store methane for methane-powered cars. Dr. Frank Sherba is a thought leader in COPD research. He's helped us understand the effects of oxygen on the body, and that kind of goes into how the doctrine of oxygen is changing within the U.S. Army as well. Dr. Sean Smerick is our veterinary advisor. He's a critical care specialist who's helped us launch our first commercial product successfully. And then Chad Burgess helps us on operations. He was a battle captain in 2008 in Iraq, and he managed the operations of around 1,200 troops. He's really been helping us get a little more acquainted with how to work in the defense space. So that's all I have for you today. I'd be happy to take any questions. You guys can come up and play around with the canisters a little bit as well.
So I have a question about the density of the canister. That one is thicker, this one is thinner, correct? Does the elements, the environmental elements, affect this one because it's thinner?
No, it doesn't actually. So they are actually both made of aluminum. so there's no reaction going on there. So we haven't experienced any problems with what type of cylinder based on the thickness we put it into.
But does the flow rate change with temperature with the canister? Because, I mean, if it's an absorbent, the oxygen has to be released by the absorbent material, so there should be a temperature component to that.
Exactly. So if you were to release that entire can, it would get slightly cold, but it really doesn't affect anything. The flow rate will decrease a little, but our fixed flow rate regulator takes care of that. And at the end of it, we actually do end up with a little bit of oxygen still in the tank because desorption is not perfect, but it's usually less than a liter. So when we display an amount of oxygen, we're displaying the total deliverable oxygen there. But yeah, that's a great question. The temperature change isn't great enough to affect anything in practice other than it does feel a little cold.
So the material that you put inside your cylinders in the wild, is it hazardous to breathe, or, I mean, if it's not in your cylinder, does it cause any hazard?
So you don't want to breathe it in, which is why we have filters on all of the cylinders you see right here. So the core technology is the material, but there's a lot of issues about implementing the material that we've solved that make this a pragmatic solution. So the manufacturing was a difficult hurdle because the desorption you mentioned that cools it down is the opposite when we fill it up. It gets incredibly hot. That makes it difficult to manufacture. But the materials themselves are not hazardous. They're actually fairly similar to what you would find in your brittle water filter. So they're not hazardous once they're out. We just have to prevent respiration of those materials. So we have a 0.5 micron filter on all the regulators and all the cans.
So if there's an issue with the regulator, how does that affect?
If there's an issue with the regulator? Yeah, so these do need that technology needs our regulator to function because of the filter and because the actuation mechanism was also an invention. So our patent protection also depends on the regulator, right? It was the ability to make a high precision regulator with a very economical and cost-effective canister like that. So we're still working on the regulator. That one is robust enough to be used in veterinary use cases, but if we were to use it, let's say in a halo insertion, it would need to be a little more robust and not have any failures in terms of falling out. So if you hold that cylinder upside down, it doesn't fall out, but it needs to basically apply it. I guess what it needs to adhere to is MIL standard 810, which is what we've been working on for the ruggedization. But that's a good point. It isn't useful if the regulator doesn't work perfectly, because that's what delivers the oxygen.
So is the AER01 essentially identical to your paw print oxygen as a solution? So
that product actually has slightly different materials to make sure it lasts longer. So the feedback we've heard is that the shelf life of a product needs to be a lot longer for the military because it is ordered in large quantities and might be stored for a long period of time. So the materials determine the shelf life. So the paw print product has a shelf life of 2 years, which is pretty much industry standard, and AER01 will have a shelf life of significantly higher than that. We hope double that, right? And we're working on the testing of that right now.
Okay. And your label here shows recyclable. Is it refillable?
So they are in practice, and that's something we're working on. So the main regulating body we're working with here, rather than against, is the Department of Transportation. So they require anything in a low-pressure aluminum container to have sorry, I lost my train of thought there. They require anything like that to not be allowed to be refilled, no matter what. We can safely do it, especially because it's low-pressure refilling. They've just never had it done, because usually you're dealing with like an air freshener or something like that. But since we're filling it with gas, we can do it, and we've done it in practice. We just have to work on the regulation bodies and make sure that they know we're doing it, because that would really cut down on waste. It's recyclable, but we don't even want to have a recyclable material at some point.
Right, well, I'm just thinking of halo operations where it may be advantageous for a unit that does that to be able to refill a tank or have the ability to refill a tank rather than, have disposable and have to buy them all the time. And so that may be a capability set that they may be interested in that may not necessarily fit within a DOT application.
That's a very good point. And actually on the cost-effective part, what we've tried to do is lower the costs so that if you do have to buy a lot, it's not expensive. Right now, the cost of goods on that canister is around $4, including materials. So we've tried to make it low enough that even if you have to go through a lot of them, but ideally we don't even want to waste that material. So you're definitely correct there.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.